Hi there, I am Lizzie Bean, the founder and owner of Stitch People, and I'm here to walk you through the week 1 homework for the Michaels and DMC and Stitch People How to Cross Stitch and Learn Basic Embroidery Techniques class. In our first class, we learned about cross stitching, what it is, what materials are needed, and how to get started. And now I'm going to give you just a little bit of bonus instruction to get you on your way to being a more confident cross stitcher. So follow along in this video. We're going to stitch the door in the Sherlock Holmes pattern and learn some techniques as we go. So the first thing that I'm going to do to finish the door detailing here is run my needle through some of the stitching on the back side of my portrait. This will hold down the end tail of my embroidery floss, and I can just cut that close and be done. Now I'm going to count the distance on my pattern between the door knocker and the little envelope slot. I'll adjust my position here in just a sec. And I'm going to start my stitching by just bringing my needle up through from the back to the front once I've counted this out. And as I begin stitching this, I'm going to leave a tail on the back. Remember, no knots. And I'll hold that tail with my finger while I start to stitch, and I'll secure that tail as I go, just with the natural loops that happen on the back of the fabric, just naturally as I stitch along. So now I'm going to work on this little letter envelope slot, and you'll see that the sides of this shape are pointed. That means it utilizes half stitches, diagonal stitches. So as I stitch this element of the pattern, I'm just going to create diagonal stitches in the direction indicated on the pattern. And I'm going to create a straight stitch to sort of fill in the gap between those two diagonal stitches in the middle there. A horizontal straight stitch. Now I'm going to complete the bottom row of cross stitches, and I'm going to do this a row at a time by completing all of the base diagonals going the same direction, and then the side of the envelope slot. And then I'm going to create all of the over diagonals that go the same direction and complete a row at a time. Remember, as you stitch, whether you stitch each individual cross stitch in full as you go or stitch in rows or columns, that's totally up to personal preference. There's no right or wrong way, and both of those methods are very traditional. The English method of stitching is to complete each cross stitch individually, and the Danish method of cross stitching is to complete in rows, and I tend to use a combination of both. So I'm just going to finish up this letter slot on the door, finishing that top row. And anticipating what's coming up, the next elements that are to be stitched in this gold color are hinges in the doors to the left and the doorknob to the right. And because there's a bit of distance between this letter slot and those elements, I'm going to end my floss just like I did at the start of this video by pulling my needle through the back side of my stitching to secure that tail. I'm going to clip it off, and I'm going to work on the other elements individually. So taking a look at my pattern and counting, just looking at the grid, I can count how far the distance is between that letter opener element of the door and the gold element on the right side. That's a little doorknob or a lock area. I can count the distance between those two elements and know exactly where to bring my needle through the fabric for that door handle or lock mechanism on the right side because of counting, because the grid of the pattern translates directly to the grid of the A to fabric. So I bring my needle up, I hold the tail, And I use the natural looping on the backside of the fabric to secure that tail so I don't have to create a knot. And this is something you'll get very, very used to the more you cross stitch. And once you become a pro at this, it's not scary or overwhelming at all to change colors, jump into different elements here, there, and everywhere all around your pattern. The trick is accurate counting more than it is starting or stopping your floss. So I can just feed my needle through the loops of the stitches on the back side of the portrait and clip that tail off, get it nice and short, keep it real tidy. And I can move on to the 3 hinges on the left side of the door. Now this is a scenario where each of these hinges is only one single cross stitch, and that's not going to be enough looping on the back side of the fabric, if you will, per stitch to secure the tail. So what I'm going to do is use one length of floss to complete all 3 of these. I'm not going to stop and clip my floss off in between like I have been for the other elements. Because the door is black, you won't see the gold through the holes of the Aida fabric because the black is dark enough to sort of negate that color out. Nothing will shine through, especially because there's solid stitching that would cover up any light that would shine through to show the long length of floss that goes between these individual cross stitches that are the hinges of the doors. So counting between the hinges, just want to make sure I get them correctly placed. Just one cross stitch. And counting between to get it correctly placed at the bottom as well. And just a reminder, as you can see, one of my pro tips for cross stitching is to keep your focus on the front side of your work as much as possible. Avoid flipping back and forth as much as you can, unless you're kind of starting or stopping, just like this, where I can flip my portrait around, feed my needle through the back side to end my floss. But while stitching, I really try and keep the focus on the front of my portrait to prevent tangling, to prevent confusion. That's a good tip. So we clip that off and then get going with the black floss. So we use 3 strands because we're using size 14 Aida fabric. We're going to use 3 of the threads of the 6-strand floss. I'm going to cut a length of the black floss, that's DMC 310, to stitch the door. And a general good rule of thumb is to hold the tip of the floss between your thumb and forefinger, and then cut a length either to your elbow or up to your bicep. That's generally a very comfortable length of floss to work with. So I'm going to do that and separate the 6 strands into 2 groups of 3, so I can use one group of those 3 threads to stitch my door. I'm going to thread my needle, and remember, no knots. I just leave a little bit of a tail, and that'll be perfect to get going on this door. Referencing the pattern, I can figure out where I need to start this black floss. I'm just going to start it underneath the left door hinge, and I'm going to count across to the right how many stitches I'm going to need, which in this case is 11. Because I like to stitch in rows, I'm going to do all of the bottom diagonals first and then go back the other direction doing all the top diagonals. And remember, this is another pro tip, is to make sure all of the bottom diagonals go the same direction and all of the top diagonals go the same direction. That makes your work look really consistent, really clean, gives it that nice professional look. So I'm going to work across, and I'm flipping over here at the beginning of my stitching just to make sure that I'm catching that tail and getting it to lay nice and flat along the back side of my portrait. But once I have that tail down, I'm not going to flip back and forth to see where I need to put my needle. I'm going to train that hand-eye coordination and keep my focus on the front. And now that that tail is down, I can get going on completing this row. And once again, from this view, you can really see through the holes of the Aida fabric to see the back side where between those 3 single stitches on the left side that are the hinges of the door, you can see the continuation of the floss on the back side from one stitch to another. Once again, the black color is so dark, and because we are filling in the door, it's going to be so filled in, you won't be able to see that when we're done. If I were to leave that fabric blank, if that's what the pattern demanded, I would have clipped my floss in between each of those stitches and just done my best to secure it on the back so that you wouldn't see through like that. Okay, and now I've got all of my stitches, 11 across, and I can go back the other direction and complete my cross stitching. Now that we've reviewed the basics and we understand kind of the theory of cross stitching, I'm just going to utilize the speed option of the video to speed through the stitching a little bit so you don't have to sit through the entirety of my cross stitching. But going back this direction, we're just going to speed it up a little. It might speed up a little bit more throughout this video as well, just so that you can see the full process, but not necessarily have to spend so much time watching the video before you see it all come together. So now that I've completed this row, I can just go up one row to the next row and do all my diagonals across one direction and all my diagonals across the other direction. And I'll keep doing that all the way up the door. As I hit the diagonals in the letter opener and the knocker area, I'll slow down again and explain how I'm going to tackle those diagonal half stitches to make sure that the shapes reflect what they're meant to. So this is just a quick time lapse, building up that door. And now we're approaching, quick floss swap, ran out of length. And now we're approaching that letter opener. Let me walk you through it. So once again, I am self-taught, and this is how I like to do half stitches. I like to just do a side-by-side diagonal stitch of the two colors that need to share that particular square of the Aida fabric. So sometimes what I do is, as I'm pulling that second color tight, we've already got the letter opener with the one diagonal. As I'm pulling, in this case, the black floss tight in that same corner, I'll use my needle as a bit of a tool, utilizing the point to keep those threads separate as I pull it tight. And I'll often utilize a fingernail as well and kind of hold one color to the side while I pull the other color tight. And that allows the ultimately 6 strands of floss in that square of fabric. That's 2 sets of 3 strands of floss in 2 different colors. It'll let them lay side by side and you'll get that real sharp diagonal. That's the way I like to do it. I'm sure there are other ways to do it. I'm sure there are more traditional methods of doing half stitches, but that is my method, and that's how I'm going to complete most, if not all, of the diagonals in this portrait, especially all in the door, as you'll see. But moving on, we'll kind of take them as we go. So there I am, utilizing my fingernail to sort of push the threads apart. As I pull the black floss tight, it lets the gold floss sit just right next to it. We get a nice sharp diagonal, and I can finish out this section of stitching. So moving right along, the only obstacle, so to speak, that I'm going to be running into from here on out is the hinges and the little doorknob lock on the right side. And those are just cross stitches, so I treat them just like I would if I were stitching them in black, just stitch around them. Swap out my floss, running out of length. And approaching the knocker in the center of the door, I will treat it just like I did with the letter opener, where I'm going to utilize my needle and my fingernail essentially to keep the floss threads separate so that they really lay side by side in those diagonal stitches. So zooming in here a little bit so that maybe you can see it a little more closely. I'm using my needle to just sort of pre-prep my hole in the Aida fabric there, so it's easy for me to find from the back. And I bring that through and I pull the existing diagonal to the side with my fingernail and just flush out that diagonal with the black floss. And finishing out the cross stitches there, I approach the other side of that knocker and I use that same process. Just go a little bit more slowly, separate the strands of floss as I go to get a nice crispy diagonal. Again, I invite you, if you have another method that you prefer, to absolutely use that method. Feel free to let your creativity go. And then the rest is pretty much smooth sailing, just more rows of black cross stitching, swapping out as you need to when you run out of length. Securing the tail without using any knots, and stitching right along. So now I'm going to be stitching the top strip of the door and the bottom stairs, which utilize DMC color, let's see here, 3782 light mocha brown. That's for the steps and the archway above the door, which has a row of stitching as its base. So I'm going to get that color ready, cut a length, separate the 6-strand floss into 3 strands and use 3 strands at a time on my size 14 Aida fabric, and we will start stitching those rows just like we stitched the black rows of cross stitches for the door. So again, I'm just completing this in a row at a time where I do all of the under diagonals, if you will, of the cross stitch in the row, and then I go back the other direction doing all the over diagonals for those cross stitches. Just kind of more of the same there. Big swaths of space like this, big shapes like this, rows of color, rows and columns of the same color. It's really good for practice. For anyone who's new to cross stitching, just this repetitive motion of cross stitching really helps you get used to it. And something to keep note of as you go along, when you have a cross stitch project that doesn't have a lot of empty white space, like this door is totally fully stitched, you just want to make sure that you're using your needle to your advantage and poking it, pushing it right through the whole of the Aida fabric. Try not to catch threads of existing stitches, or else it might make some of your cross stitching sort of spread unevenly or look generally a little bit uneven. Just try and really aim through the hole. Make sure your needle is going alongside the existing stitches and not sort of through the threads of those existing stitches. That's just something to keep in mind as you go, especially with these big areas. And that is it for the door for our Sherlock Holmes pattern. We have the black door with the gold elements, the hinges, knocker, letter opener, and lock/handle on the right side. And then we have the beige steps and base of the archway at the top of the door ready to go.